Well, one of my guilty pleasures is watching survival shows on television. Every show has the same theme. 1, 2, or more people, volunteers, are dropped off in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in the world. They're given only a map and one item they can bring from home. It's their job to survive until they're picked up again 2 weeks or 6 weeks or however many weeks later. And at first the people are really brave and happy and optimistic. And then after the first night, they're hungry, thirsty, and covered in bug bites. After a few nights, they either find a way to bond with each other or they turn on each other in ways that are quite destructive. Now, invariably, when asked for the reason they go on these wilderness adventures, it is because they want to test themselves. And not everyone passes the test. Some participants leave the adventures for medical reasons, but most end up leaving because the temptations of home, food, insect-free, comfort, and companionship are just too strong to overcome. They yield to the temptations and go home. Now, those who stay the full length of the adventures seem to have one thing in common. They believe that nature will provide for them. They trust a higher power, whether that's God, nature, the land, or all three, to take care of them. That belief gives them the hope and the strength they need to spend time in the wilderness. The time isn't easy, but with a belief in something greater than themselves that will provide for them, they make it through the test. Now, the Gospel of Mark tests Jesus early in his writing. Mark wrote that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. He heard the voice proclaiming him as God's beloved Son with whom God was well pleased. And immediately after that highlight moment, the Spirit of God drove Jesus into the wilderness, and there he was tempted by the adversary, and he was surrounded by wild beasts. And even as he was tempted, Jesus was cared for by God's angels. Now, Mark's gospel was the first gospel written that is still preserved today. And because of that, Mark's reference to Jesus as the Son of God in the first chapter just didn't mean the same thing we mean when we say Jesus is the Son of God. For Mark, calling Jesus the Son of God meant that Jesus had a special status with God. King David had a special status with God. The prophet Moses had a special status with God. Even the Romans believed Caesar had a special status with God and proclaimed him as the Son of God. So for Mark, calling Jesus the Son of God was a symbolic or figurative term. It did not mean for Mark that Jesus was literally God's Son. So in Mark's gospel, temptation also meant testing. And because Mark identified Jesus as primarily human, that testing was very real. Before he began his ministry, Jesus had to be tested. And he was tested because being the Messiah during Roman rule was not going to be easy. Some people would love him. Most people wouldn't care one way or another. But the people who didn't like him would be those with power and the necessary abilities to either imprison or kill him. Jesus knew he would begin his ministry alone. He knew he would have to leave his family, his work, his income, his friends, his home, all of that behind. He knew he would have to live on the road where he would depend on the kindness of others to offer him food, shelter, and support. Every comfort, every companion, every support he knew in life would be left behind in Galilee. And Jesus knew that he would face the temptation to quit and return home to food, family, comfort, a routine every single day, every moment of every single day. And God knew how hard his mission was going to be, so Jesus was tested in the wilderness. He needed to know if he could pass the test. He needed to know that he could resist all of the temptations to just quit and go home. He needed to know his connection with God was stronger than the temptations offered to him by the serpent. He needed to know what he was getting himself into. So Jesus entered the wilderness. We all live through times of wilderness, and most of us do not literally set off to go get lost in the wilderness. At least we don't do so without a plan, support, and adequate supplies. But we do find ourselves thrust into times that are not anything like what we expected in life. Job loss, death, illness, accidents, aging. Nobody gave me the handbook on aging. Did they, you? I never got one. But anyway, all those things, everything we've experienced during the past year of the pandemic has put us into the wilderness. And we found ourselves in places and situations where we have felt lost, absolutely lost, with nothing familiar to offer us hope, to offer us help, or to offer us comfort. This past year has been a time in the wilderness between the pandemic, politics, and the weather. Well, they've combined to put us in situations that we never anticipated and most of us have never encountered before. We've endured a seemingly endless wilderness. Anybody else feel like that? This has gone on forever. We're kind of getting tired of it. We've endured a seemingly endless wilderness. Parents, grandparents, teachers, and students have been thrown into the wilderness of education through technology. We've been in the wilderness of quarantine and isolation. We're in the wilderness of worshiping online without a full congregation, and even though we're back without singing to buoy our spirits. We're in the wilderness of job loss or underemployment, food shortages, isolation, illness, accidents, and people we know and love that we worry about or that we grieve for. Now, we've been in the wilderness long enough to kind of get used to it. I mean, I walk in, put on a mask, and don't think a lot about it. I suspect you're the same. I go into a grocery store wearing a mask, and I think it's going to feel weird to not have one someday. I think we're going to have an anxiety about going maskless as much as we've had an anxiety about putting them on. We are still in the wilderness. Make no mistake, we are living in the wilderness with the wild beasts, the temptations, and the tests that come along with the wilderness. And in this time, we've been tempted to reject science, and we've been tempted to reject truth. We've been tempted to disregard safety warnings and just throw caution to the winds and go without masks, gather in large crowds, sing our hearts out, and put ourselves and everyone else at risk because, after all, we've been safe so far. We've been tempted to blame teachers, parents, and students for difficulty in learning. We've been tempted to find scapegoats for the spread of the pandemic and for the spread of the unrest around us. Our faith in God and each other has been tested and then tested some more. Sound familiar? Yeah. Jesus passed the test of the wilderness by trusting God to care for him. And with that first big test of his faith and his commitment behind him, Jesus left the wilderness to begin his public ministry. Time of temptation and wilderness would come throughout his ministry, but Jesus now knew that he could trust God to sustain him. Now, we've all spent time in the wilderness before, but this is the first time we've been in the wilderness without the usual rituals and supports to sustain us. Public worship, going out to sports, going to restaurants, going to movies, even shopping have not really been available to us. Gathering with friends for support and care, they've been off limit. Every tool that we've used to overcome temptations and tests before has been unavailable to us, except for God and God's angels. Through this time, we have been cared for and we have been comforted by God's angels. God's angels are the people who have called us when we were lonely. God's angels are the people in the grocery stores who shopped for us and then delivered our groceries to our cars. God's angels are the health care workers and family members who cared for us when we were sick. God's angels are all the thoughts, all the hymns, all the Bible verses, all the prayers that have brought us comfort when we've been afraid, alone, and anxious. God's angels are the friends who have listened, laughed, and understood us. God's angels are all around us. And with God's presence and God's angels, we have withstood the temptation, and so far we are passing the test. This time in the wilderness isn't easy, and it's certainly not over. But it's valuable, because throughout this time of testing and temptation, we have learned that God is present in our lives, in whatever wilderness we may find ourselves. We have learned that God comes to us in all as angels, in all shapes and forms and thoughts to care for us. We have learned we can trust God to provide what we need to resist temptation and pass the test. This time in the wilderness will come to an end. And I have no doubt when it does come to an end, God is going to show us more ways to engage in ministry with each other and our communities than we had thought of before. And because we will have passed the time of testing, we will have the confidence in God's presence to go ahead and sign up for the adventure God has for us next. And we can do that because God and God's angels will go with us.